with that much defense spending, it's going to be quite difficult to return to a pre-war economic posture. And that may be one of the reasons that Putin continues to push and continues to reject any concept of a ceasefire. I happen to think his reasons are far more ideological and political than economic, but who knows, perhaps the economic realities factor. It's hard to say that the Russian economy remains one firmly grounded in capitalism. Sure. I think what we're looking at is 50 billion in assets that Russia has confiscated from its own citizens in the last 3 years. And that's in addition to the exodus of Western companies and Western investment, which has also meant that the Russian wealth has had to be focused inwards instead of engaging in the international system. And then when you add the fact that there are considerable labor shortages, for example, something like 11 million workers are deemed missing. 73% of Russian enterprises at this point are claiming to be facing labor shortages. So you are absolutely looking at a complete transformation of the Russian economy for right now. It has become almost entirely dependent on oil and gas exports for incoming wealth. And internally, as much as 50 or 60% of the budget is war spending by the government. It's being put into manufacturing or into industries that are supporting the war effort. All that said, Russia has absolutely not collapsed. And the Russian economy, because it is so buttressed by natural resources, it has the number one gas reserves in the world, something like 25% of global natural gas. It has the number 8 crude oil reserves in the world, which is something like 5% of global reserves. These commodities, as well as minerals, rare earth metals, etc., are not going to lose their value on the global economy. And so until such a time as there is an adequate transition in the world away from hydrocarbons, Russia will always have what the rest of the world wants. And its ability to bypass or circumnavigate sanctions thus far, partly because the sanctions were not fulsome, has also meant that, right, it will also mean going forward that Russia will be able to do so in perpetuity, again, until such a time as oil and gas are not the critical commodities that drive the global economy. So Russia is still looking at a 4 to 4.5% GDP growth. At least that was last year. And this year, it looks like it will be down a little bit. But despite a few bad economic indicators, the Russian economy seems mostly okay. Reports of its demise are somewhat exaggerated. And I think that we can anticipate that to continue for a bit longer.
But you say reports of its demise are somewhat exaggerated, but there are some difficulties. You mentioned Russia's effectively confiscated $50 billion worth of assets from its own people, but it's got $300 billion worth of assets frozen in different banks around the world, $200 billion of it in Belgian banks. And the interest from that has been used to fund Ukraine. Ukrainian weapons and other items for Ukraine as well. Russia seems to be having difficulty in getting the personnel it needs to go into the factories to support its economic outputs. And certainly when it comes to its military industrial base, it's quite clear that it can't keep up with the usage in the front lines because it's now relying on North Korea to supply artillery shells and rockets, and it relied on Iran to bring drone technology in. Would it be right to describe the Russian economy as creaking at the moment? And if the international community really focused on oil and lowered the price cap that is imposed, dealt with the shadow fleet and possibly these 100% secondary tariffs on countries that buy Russian oil and gas, that might really hurt Putin.
The Russian economy is so natural resource based, and the war shows no signs of slowing, such that together, creaking though it may be, it continues to defy all expectations of collapse or even contraction to a point at which it would have trouble continuing to prosecute the war. Yes, there are millions of workers missing. Yes, every day of the war costs Russia somewhere between 500 million and $1 billion. Nonetheless, with 75%, maybe 70 of spending being driven by the state into war industries, I don't think we're quite at a point where that tip is going to happen. And a lot of that, yes, is buoyed by oil and gas revenues. And indeed, despite the initial many rounds of sanctions that were put in place immediately following the full-scale invasion and eventually taken up by the European Union later that year, the phasing in of first pipeline gas restrictions, followed by tanker oil, etc., it was never comprehensive. And it was not designed to be comprehensive. The Biden White House did not want comprehensive sanctions on Russia for a couple of reasons. First, because there were elections coming, but of course in the United States, there are always elections coming. And there is this widely held fallacy, widely believed fallacy, that oil prices on the global market are somehow directly related to the price Americans pay for petrol at the pump, which of course they aren't. And in fact, the US doesn't even refine its own oil. We refine imported oil from countries like Saudi, and we export our own oil because our refineries in the United States are not built for that kind of refining. So nonetheless, the advent of elections meant that the White House did not want to have prices go up. And the United States also did not want to force the European Union into a really tight energy corner. The European Union had made itself, and different member states to varying degrees, extremely vulnerable to Russian coercion, to Russian energy dominance. You take a country like Austria, which was 75% reliant on Russian gas imports. Germany was hugely reliant on natural gas imports. The European Union as a whole was importing 45% of its natural gas from Russia and getting it very cheap. And as a consequence, Putin seems to have relatively correctly calculated that Europe could not afford to do anything particularly major as a response to its invasion of Ukraine. And the relative weakness of the many different sanctions packages with respect to energy have proved that to be true. But unfortunately, energy is what counts because it is natural gas and now crude oil that is keeping the Russian economy principally afloat. And in the years following, we're now 3 years deep, right? Over 3 years, the full-scale invasion, Russia's oil revenue skyrocketed. It went way up. So any notion that, for example, the original price cap that was put on Russian crude worked is, I think, very wishful thinking. And right now, the European Union is debating strengthening that price cap. There is a consideration to drop it 15%, a floating 15% below whatever global oil market rates are. There is apparently one European Union member state that has refused to agree to this. Reports say we don't know who it is. I think the usual suspect would be Hungary, but actually it could also be Greece, could be Malta, could be Cyprus. There are a number that have never been full-throated in their support of sanctions on Russian energy. But that is under consideration right now. Also under consideration is a full European Union ban on LNG, liquefied natural gas. because although pipeline gas is no longer going into Europe from Russia, nonetheless, Russian liquefied natural gas, LNG, has gone way up as a source for European energy imports. And indeed, a couple of months ago, there were reports of Russian shadow fleet tankers pulling straight into EU ports to offload Russian commodities. And so I don't think we can talk about Russia really transforming into a completely different economy when those fundamentals will remain in place. Nonetheless, it's true that with that much defense spending, it's going to be quite difficult to return to a pre-war economic posture. And that may be one of the reasons that Putin continues to push and continues to reject any concept of a ceasefire. I happen to think his reasons are far more ideological and political than economic, but who knows, perhaps the economic realities factor.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like to be amongst the first to get exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership at the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs or read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.